Good afternoon, students. This is Ms. Valdez, your librarian, and I wanted to talk to you today on understanding copyright policies regarding to a understanding that a research project is coming up within your classroom. So we wanted to make sure, me and Ms. Stewart wanted to make sure that you understood what that meant when it comes to finding sources on the web and how we can protect ourselves from violating copyright laws and policies. So we'll go ahead and get started. So our objectives today are the learner will understand the meaning of copyright and its policies. The learner will understand the consequences when copyright laws and policies are violated. The learner will learn the importance of copyright policies and how they are respectfully practiced when using outside sources. And the learner will learn how to properly use outside sources in their works in respects to copyright laws and policies. So your question might be, well, what is copyright, Ms. Valdez? Well, copyright refers to the legal rights to an original work or product. These laws and policies protect the credit that the original owners of the work deserve. So, for example, when you write a paper on whales and someone wants to use part of your written words, that person may or may not use your work as part of their written work because it is illegal. So what makes that so illegal? Well, let's go back to that meaning. So copyright refers to the legal rights to an original work or product. So when someone, like yourself, for example, you tend to take the time to work on a paper, write a paper on whales, and you do all this research, you gather that information. I mean, that's a lot of work for you to have to put together. And so when you make that public or accessible to anybody else that maybe is searching the same topic, they use your information. You don't want to have somebody use your information and then they go around, turn around and say, oh yeah, I wrote this. This is coming from me. You don't ever want to have the impression that somebody else is taking credit for your hard work. Therefore, that's why copyright exists, so that when you create something, you have your rights that protect that work from somebody else using it illegally. Okay. However, when there are sources that you wish to use, because you can come across a source or work that you really want to use depending on how good it is, there is a way to use them legally and without violating the copyright laws and policies. So before we move on to the next thing, when we do violate the copyright laws and policies, it can be pretty extreme to where, depending on whether you're copying directly from somebody else or their work and you are not citing them properly, that can lead to being expelled from school, or if it's through work, you can be fired from your job. You can end up paying thousands of dollars to the original owner. Or potentially go to jail, because it is a very, very serious act. And so we want to make sure that you understand that copyright is just as important as anything else. So it is pretty much breaking a law, because it is violating the rights of somebody else that worked so hard to create something that you are using, and then on top of that, not giving them credit for it. Okay. But don't panic. The copyright laws and policies can be used through fair use, what is called fair use. So students and teachers have this access. They're provided copyright exceptions through fair use. What this means is that when students and teachers properly cite the sources through their works, fair use can be determined through the application of 4 major criteria. Because we are in an educational environment, we are given that right to use certain sources through fair use. Some of the things you want to consider, though, is number 1, purpose of the use of source. So what that means is, what is your reason behind using a certain work or source? It has to be for educational reasons, and it cannot be for business reasons. Okay, so we know the difference between when using educational or using resources for your education as opposed to for business. Okay, the nature of the copyrighted work. So what that means is, usually you as general readers You'll have access to magazines, newspapers, books, certain things like that, that can be used for through fair use. So you can use those things um, within your works as long as they're properly cited. However, even if you properly cite certain other resources like entertainment resources, like movies, cartoons, and music, those may not be supported through the fair use. So that's where it gets a little bit tricky. Um, the amount or portions use of copyright source. So how much of that work are you going to use within your work? The more you use, the potential there is for you to violating those laws and policies. But if you stick to using as less as possible, it's a lot better for you. So you want to just focus on when you do use a work or any materials that are protected through copyright, because like I said, mostly everything that people create is protected through copyright. So the less that you use of that source, the better. And then what effect does that work have when it comes to you using it in your own work? So you don't want it to have a negative effect on, they say, on sales. So usually you don't want to be the reason why you influence others on a company or something. I'm just throwing out an example there. And that can potentially harm businesses, locations, or anything like that. So you don't want to use certain things that can be used, and it can potentially affect the sales. Another example would be if you do a research paper on a book that you read and then you say, oh, it's so bad, I don't know why this person wrote it, you can potentially affect the sales that source has. So you don't ever want to be a negative influence on certain sources. Permissions through the use of copyright content. Some copyright resources and materials may need permission before being used if they are not open to the public for use. So in other words, if they're not free for you to use, then you have to ask permission. Permission can be granted through asking the owner of the work or source to be granted that permission, or pay a fee in order to gain permission to use the work or source. So sometimes when we go online and we find certain articles and they probably ask you to purchase them before you can even read it, that's kind of granting that permission, because they are not having it being accessible to the public for free. Okay. Using copyright materials, once that permission is granted, and you know you can use the work or source, there are certain ways in which sources can be cited or given credit to its original owner. Some of these ways that you can properly cite sources is through summarizing. So remember, summarizing is something that you learn in reading. So when you read a book and your teacher asks you summarize what you just read, you are not going to give exactly everything that you read from that book, that work, that text in word for word. Okay, so when you summarize, you basically take the most important parts of a book that you read or a work that you read, and you basically put it in your own words. Paraphrasing is almost like summarizing. You can read a statement or two, a sentence or two from that text or that book, and you can basically say it in about the same way with actually changing a couple of words so that it doesn't look like you're copying directly from the work or the text. And that's where quoting directly comes in. You can do that as long as you properly give credit to the owner based on using the owner's name and the publishing date. So I do have an example here. So according to Anderson, that's the author of whatever work that I'm using, there are, and then as soon as I start my quotations, I am writing down exactly what he used in his work. So this is what exactly he wrote in his work, and I'm taking that part from his work, but I'm also making sure that I'm citing. I'm basically saying, hey, I'm giving credit to this person, Anderson, and the publishing date, which was 2018. Things to consider when citing a source. So when you're using any works and sources, there are things to consider when citing them. So one of those things is going to be the author's name. So it's very important that you know who wrote that article, that book, that journal, that newspaper, text. You want to make sure that you know that that is that person when you're citing. The title of the book, article, or passage, or journal. You want to make sure that you have the appropriate titles. The date of publication, when was this work published, and then a page number. So if you're looking at sources that have multiple pages, you want to make sure you specify, you give a specific page number. And then the volume and issue number. So this has to do more with articles. And we'll look at that more in depth if you ever do find, once we start getting into looking into articles, they have those things. So again, it's just very important to be as specific as possible, because sometimes the author's name can be the same name as 20 other authors. The title can be similar or almost the same to 10 other articles or books. So you want to make sure that we're tying all of this in together to specifically cite that work that we looked at or we're looking at. At the bottom, I've included an example. So Barnitzky, SC, and then the publishing date, the title of, I think it's a journal or an article. And then this would be considered the volume and issue numbers down here. One thing that I want you to consider is that as we go through this presentation, we are going to have the opportunity to practice citing those resources so that we can properly practice copyright policies in respect to making sure that we give credit where credit should be given. So this is what the rubric is going to look like, and everybody will get a copy just so that you can use that as reference to what I am looking for whenever we're practicing these copyright laws and policies. And just to reflect back on our objectives. So what we learned, we understood the meaning of copyright and its policies. We also understood the consequences when copyright laws and policies are violated. We've learned that the importance of copyright policies and how they are respectfully practiced when using outside sources. And we also learned how to properly use outside sources in their works in respect to copyright laws and policies. I know the presentation was pretty brief. We did cover these objectives. Of course, we're going to practice and go more in depth to fully understand what that looks like as we practice citing those sources and making sure we give the correct orders. Okay. I just want to close with this quote. The beauty of copyright law is 1, it protects you, and 2, it provides you the opportunity to honor another. Okay, so you want to make sure you are giving the credit that a person deserves for their work that they have contributed for your use. Okay, so using copyright laws and policies respectfully helps protect the credibility of others' work. So if it is not your work, don't take credit for it. I want you to think about that and keep in mind that statement when you think about copyright. If it is not your work, don't take credit for it, okay? Again, this is Ms. Valdez, your librarian, and I will make sure to work with your teacher in regards to any other questions that you may have concerning copyright laws and policies. So we're going to go ahead and dive into practicing these things.